Thank you very much for joining us today for the launch of our data challenge, Fire Ready Forests. This is the first data challenge that we're offering through partnership with the National Data Platform, the ProWESS Center, and the Wildfire Science and Technology Commons. And we're very excited to see the initial interest in participating in this activity. This data challenge will be geared towards students primarily, although all of the data and the lightning talks and different materials that are made available to students who are participating in the data challenge will also be shared with anyone who registers for information and available through the National Data Platform's Education Hub. And so we would encourage people who have an interest in this work to share the registration information widely so that people who would like to learn more can be part of the group here. And we're very excited to see this partnership coming together because the National Data Platform will be our resource for data and computational resources needed for the data challenge. Our UC San Diego LANL partnership through the ProWESS Center, founded by Rod Lin and Ilkay Altintash, will be an important partnership for bringing scientists from different disciplines together to mentor the students and participants in the data challenge. And then, of course, our Wildfire Science and Technology Commons community will bring together a community of practice for folks who are interested in this kind of work and the way that it can be, that it can contribute to tools and solutions in the real world for increasing resilience to wildland fire. Let me give you just a little bit of background first on the timeline for the data challenge. So today, of course, November 22nd is our info session and the launch of our seminar series with Dr. Rod Lin. This is being recorded, and so we will also share the webinar so that people can watch and see the details. There'll be a series of 12 lightning talks that will be shared throughout December as well, and so those can all be found at the ProWESS Center website, where we'll be holding all of the information and details about the data challenge. And then January 6th, we'll officially launch the phase 1 of the data challenge. So from January 6th to January 26th, students will have access to data sets, training modules, and also compute through the National Data Platform. And they will have until January 26th to submit their solutions. Then on January 27th, teams will present those solutions at an in-person event at UC San Diego, where we will also bring together policymakers and practitioners. And based on those presentations, we will select a group of teams who will move into phase 2 of the data challenge, which will be a paid internship where they're going to further develop their methodologies. So the phase 1 challenge is essentially to develop robust fire models for prescribed bird planning. We need high resolution and accurate representations of landscapes. And many of the data sources that we use currently for that rely on fairly low resolution or 2D data inputs. But of course, the better the vegetation model, the better the fire model outputs. And so we're going to provide students with both data and 4 approaches that we use across our teams at UC San Diego and LANL currently. And using that, participants will create their own data products that help them build a foundational understanding of our data and approaches. And at that point, they'll analyze and compare those data products to identify strengths and weaknesses, and also use them as inputs to fire models. And so this piece of the data challenge is what the teams will be judged on January 27th. And then after that point, moving into phase 2 in the internship portion of our data challenge, teams will go on to build their own approaches to modeling all the trees across a landscape in terms of location, species, height, diameter, crown base height, and other important metrics that let us understand things like ladder fuels for fire simulation. And we will ask them to both produce methodologies for validating those new approaches and the requirements that they would have to scale the solutions they're proposing across different ecosystem types, and then help us think through areas for improvement. So we're very excited about launching this opportunity for our teams to work closely with students on this. And through our lightning talks, you will get lots of the context and training that you'll need in order to complete the data challenge successfully. So we will have experts talk to you about these 3D vegetation and fire modeling techniques so that you'll be able to understand how the data inputs to the models improve the model outputs and come up with your own AI approaches and other approaches to improving our toolkit for modeling vegetation for fire. So please do scan the QR code here if you aren't already signed up for updates, but of course we'll be sharing details with everyone who is registered here and participating this morning. And with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Rod Lynn, who is our first speaker this morning. Rod is a senior scientist in the Earth and Environmental Sciences Division at Los Alamos National Lab and the founding co-director of the ProWESS Center. He began his career in computational fluid dynamics and theoretical turbulence modeling, and is the principal investigator and developer of LANL's FireTech and QuickFire models, and is an important leader across our group here today. So thank you, Rod. I'll turn it over to you.
So as Melissa said, I'm my day job, I'll say, is at Los Alamos National Laboratory as a scientist and team leader. However, I am proud to also be a part of the UCSD team and work closely with Melissa and Ilkay and others in the UCSD Wildfire lab. So Melissa asked me just to give you a orientation on the approach that we're taking and things to think about and why we're needing some help and so forth in switching gears from the way things had been done. So obviously wildfires are a big part of they're a big part of nature. They're a big part of the interaction between nature and people, and they're not something we're going to get rid of. We've tried for a century to avoid having them on the landscape because they do cause hazards, but we're not doing a good job at it, and now it's catching up with us. So why have we not solved this problem? Why haven't we figured out how to balance this out? Well, first problem is that the things that influence fire behavior across a wide range of lengths and time scales. Everything from flame sheets to weather scales, and that's spatial as well as temporal, going from far sub-second to days. And if you want to think about the conditions that set up fires, those are weeks, months, years. So there's a lot of challenges there. But if we shift over to the upper right diagram on this slide and just think about all of the different things that roll in together to create what we think about, or what we think of as wildfire behavior, it's a really complex mess of stuff. And that diagram on the upper right is a mess, but it's a mess because that's realistic of what's going on in wildfires. And it would be one thing if all that mess of different processes was just burning on a flat surface, but it's not. It's spreading in natural vegetated settings, which are fairly complex and again have a range of length scales associated with them. So historically, there's been one focus for wildfire modeling, and it's been real-time wildfire management support. And that's driven the majority of the investment that's gone on so far, but it's also driven the way data has been collected and the way we think about providing the model inputs for these kinds of fires. I don't know why there we go. But if we now think about that in the context of other application spaces, and here I put it on a notional graph where we plot simulation speed requirements versus complexity and detail requirements. Clearly, the real-time wildfire management support is very high on speed requirements, but most people aren't very worried about the details, right? It's get people out of the way, find the right evacuation, and understand if there's any mitigation efforts that we can do, and a lot of times those are very minimal once they get to that stage. However, if we think of all of the other applications on this screen, the detail requirements go up substantially and the speed requirements typically go down. And so, so they create a different way of thinking about fire and a different opportunity space, as these are more proactive applications. The key here, though, is that these proactive applications aren't well suited for the existing models. And we need a new kind of tools and a new kind of data streams to support these applications. So just to think about some of the roles of modeling when we start thinking about proactive approaches to fire, and these might be prescribed fire, they might be understanding thinning or fuel treatments, they might be understanding risk analysis. But as we contemplate all of those different proactive applications, we realize we could be accelerating training, we could be allowing for exploration and our analysis of pros and cons of different treatments. We can look at escape potentials in the case of prescribed fire. We can look at how do we optimize a single treatment or multiple treatments? How do we think about smoke? How do we think about the trade-offs between the way we ignite fires, the smoke lift, and the ecological benefits? We can think about how do we communicate them better. We can also start thinking about carbon accounting, because fire has a big impact on the terrestrial carbon storage. But what these really come down to is fire modeling to support proactive approaches to fire is a way of doing our homework. Fires aren't all the same, and that's an important thing for people to realize. And you can see on the right-hand side now the two key examples that I want to highlight. On the upper right, you've got an intense wildfire with strong drivers, probably intense dry fuels, or abundant dry fuels, I should say, strong winds, maybe steep topography. But once you get to that fire regime, the details of the fuel at any given point in space don't matter so much. It can jump across fuel breaks. It moves between trees or bushes without a whole lot of trouble. However, lower intensity fires, which can include parts, backing or flanking aspects of an intense fire, but also prescribed fires, they oftentimes lack those strong drivers. They depend heavily on localized and time and space details, right? The conditions and both the wind conditions and fuel conditions dictate how a fire is going to move. And these are the fine scale details can be correlated with each other, right? Do you get a wind gust at the moment when the fire has to cross a single track trail? If not, it might not cross that single track trail, right? So this is actually a more challenging problem in terms of predicting the spread. Most prescribed fires fit in this category. There's a few where they're after stand replacing intensities that they just, it's okay to cook off the majority of the vegetation. And you still need to be able to understand where the fire is going to stop if you're going to light it. But an awful lot of the fires are designed to be lower intensity. They're not designed to burn all of the vegetation. And so we need to be able to predict fire in this regime. So one of the things that we have to be able to do is do a better job of understanding the role of fuels, vegetation that is, in fire. How much combustible biomass is there? How is it distributed? How is the moisture distributed within the vegetation? And the nature of the fine fuels. So as we think about representing these fuels, we need to think about how do we capture sensitivity of geographic ecosystems and gradients, the impacts of landscape management, right? If we go in there and do treatments and take out trees, that needs to be representable in the vegetation data sets that we're using for fire models. Think about the influence of natural disturbances. These might be drought. These might be beetle or insect damage, climate-induced changes. These might not be abrupt changes. They may be just a gradual decrease in biomass or change in structure. But it's important to be able to think about whether these ecosystems are homogeneous or not, because a lot of the models that are out there now just would treat all four of these ecosystems as homogeneous. That homogeneity or heterogeneity is tied to the scales of the fire activity. I showed you the two different frames of fire before. Well, these are good examples of when you're doing prescribed fire, the details matter, and the heterogeneity scales may be on the orders of tens of centimeters, for example. So how do we do this for next generation modeling? Well, we have to be able to capture the three-dimensional aspects of the vegetation structure. So we use a voxel-based grid or cell-based grid in 3D. And basically, in each one of those cells, then we can say what kind of biomass is in those cells. And so by prescribing things like the size and shape of the foliage in a given cell, the bulk density, and the moisture content in a cell, we can represent the structure of the ecosystem and allow the fire to respond appropriately. By putting those kinds of properties in each one of those cells, we have the ability to then predict the aerodynamic drag associated with a particular wind condition in that cell, the convective or radiative heat transfer, the moisture exchange, the reaction rate in each cell separately. those cells then get aggregated together to create what we usually think of as fire behavior. Because we're talking about representing fuels in a very different way, this three-dimensional matrix of cells, it also means we need to think about new ways to fill those cells. And that's largely one of the centerpieces of this data challenge. So there are ways using things like airborne LiDAR, terrestrial LiDAR, which can be co-registered, structure from motion, and we can combine those with mechanistic modeling for various different aspects of the fuel. And so by thinking about all of these different opportunities to have data streams coming together and using them to represent the overstory and the midstory and the surface fuels, we can generate that three-dimensional structure for the vegetation that's critical for driving the next generation wildfire models for those proactive applications. If we think about prescribed fires, there's a lot of opportunity to now think about different pieces of puzzle. We can think about how to burn, what to burn, where to burn, and when to burn. But by having those options to think about it, we also have the responsibility to try to meet particular objectives like risk reduction or ecological benefits. But equally important, we have to avoid the unintended or undesirable consequences, like fires escaping or creating safety risks for the practitioners that are putting fire in the landscape, or the public for that matter. We have to avoid the ecological damage. We have to avoid watershed deterioration or smoke exposure to communities or roads. So combining all these pieces, next generation modeling, next generation input decks, is critical to helping us achieve desired prescribed fire effects as opposed to the undesired ones. Whoops, sorry. Apparently there was a recording on that slide that I didn't know about. So the simulations here that are now playing are an example of a 5-line ATV prescribed fire that is very typical for what is done a lot in the Southeast. They use ATVs to drag fire. ATVs are used a little less in California, but still in some locations. But the key thing here is thinking about the fact that the vegetation is not homogeneous, and the structure here dictates the way the fire behaves. You can see on the upper part of these two images, which are the same simulation, just different points of view. The dark colors represent the fact that surface fuels have been removed. You can see roads and fuel breaks. I'll let it play through one more. And so as these ATVs move across the landscape from right to left, you can see the wind is coming from the bottom of the screen, but those fire lines are interacting with each other. And the lines on the bottom, for instance, are not behaving the same as the lines on the top. It's due to those feedbacks between the fires. So we have an opportunity to then look at realistic ignitions in more complex settings. Here's a case that at the Hitchity in the Southeast, where the ignition pattern here is not just a simple grid. It's moving across the landscape. This is on a drone. And so the flight path of the drone was actually recorded, so we could put in the realistic ignition pattern. The difference between the simulation on the left and the simulation on the right is the fact that on the right, there's slightly drier conditions than were actually used in the prescribed fire. And you can see the results in that there are escapes. Don't know if you can see my mouse, but down in the lower left corner of the simulation on the left, you'll see it escape at that hairpin corner. And then as it gets close to the stream in the bottom of this canyon that runs lower left to upper right, you'll see it jump across a couple times. So by pulling together the vegetation that's realistic for the landscape, and then be able to prescribe different kinds of conditions. And those are in 3 dimensions again, right? It's not that everything is the same moisture, but by prescribing different conditions, we can understand where the prescription envelopes start to arise. So one of the directions that we really expect to go down the road, though, and some folks like Adam actually have already started to push this direction, is to be able to combine the fuels and inventory data with fire models and put those in a system that then can predict the injury to vegetation, right? Injury to tree or shrubs, for instance. Understand the impacts on the hydrology of the system, feed that back to the plant succession. And by doing this, we can then better understand the benefits of prescribed fire for the ecosystem and the watersheds. We can optimize the frequency that we enact things like prescribed fire. And we can try to understand what the end state is. And that may include the influences of climate change, for instance. So by doing this, we can look at, gee, if you burn every 5 years or you burn every 10 years and it given on a particular landscape and ecosystem, what might the long-term effects look like in the long-term sort of steady state, which it will approach over numerous burns. And Melissa, I think I'm going to leave it there. I think I've used up as much time as you wanted me to use. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Rod, for that excellent introductory lecture to our Data Challenge series. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. As I mentioned earlier, we'll have about a dozen more talks to prepare Data Challenge participants between now and January 6th, when we'll make data sets and training modules available, as well as compute through the National Data Platform to our Data Challenge participants. So everyone will get all of the follow-up information on that. And please do, feel free to share the opportunity largely with your network and with students, especially who would be interested in participating. If there are any questions about Rod's presentation, we can certainly take them now. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and close for this morning. Rod, thank you very much for kicking us off, and thanks to everyone for joining today.